Hello, everyone. We're just going to wait 1 minute here and get everybody on. If you're having any technical issues, use the chat bar. Let us know. We'll get started here in 1 minute.
We are having issues. I don't understand who's sharing their screen.
Start in a few seconds. Are they coming?
Okay. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Kairos Center for Religions and Human Rights and Social Justice. Sorry, don't want to leave that out. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to be here. We have a real special hour planned as we anticipate the launch of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, coming up December 4th. We're very excited to be joined by one of the foremost scholars on the Poor People's Campaign in the country, Dr. Colleen Wessel-McCoy. But before we hear from her, we'd also like to take a few minutes to hear from Shelley Barnes, who is closely involved with the audit process and is going to share a little bit about what that is and how it relates to the campaign. And she just walked in the door, so she should be ready. It's been on her mind a lot these days. So just take a minute to listen to Shelley give an update on the campaign and where it's at. In particular about the audit, the Souls of Poor Folk audit. Okay, Shelley?
Hi.
Welcome.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. We are excited about our December 4th launch of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And a lot of things have been in the works and preparation for this launch, including this Souls of Poor Folk, a report that is auditing America on the past 50 years since the original Poor People's Campaign challenged our country's national morality and systemic racism and poverty and militarism. And we've been working for the past few months with the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. to do this research project. It's both empirical, historical research on what's happened in these past 50 years since the 1968 campaign, and try to assess how it is that we've come to where we are today. And we're looking at the facts and figures of what's been happening in the economy and in our communities. And we have our preliminary report coming out on Monday, December 4th, with the launch. And that preliminary report will then be supplemented with interviews and testimonies of impacted people and experts who can help us understand what's happened over these years and what we can do together, what the campaign, why we need the kind of campaign that we're building today. So it's really exciting, and it'll be available online at the poorpeoplescampaign.org website, as well as the Institute for Policy Studies website. I encourage you to look at it and then follow the news of the campaign and be in touch.
Great. Thank you, Shelley. Yeah, like Shelley said, just to reiterate that December 4th is the official launch of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and the 50th anniversary of the 1968, 67, 68 Poor People's Campaign that Martin Luther King Jr. helped to lead 50 years ago. So in anticipation of this kind of momentous occasion, this anniversary and kind of the start of a movement and a campaign that's been building for some of us for decades and others that are just joining in, but there's clearly a lot of excitement and interest about the campaign, and Kairos has been trying to provide these spaces on a weekly or a bi-weekly basis to have folks from the campaign share their insights and have more discussion about the campaign and kind of how it's unfolding. So we're thankful for so many of you to be here and to share your insights, and look forward to the discussions to come. But before I don't want to waste any more time, because we do have the rare opportunity to hear an expert on the 68 campaign, and that expert is.
Hi, before you guys start, the audio all of a sudden went kind of buggy.
Okay.
Or...
Okay. Thank you. Let's see if we can fix that. If others are having that same problem, please use the chat bar. There's so many folks on. I don't know. Okay. We're trying our best with what we have, and but yeah, please let us know. And also use the chat bar for any comments and questions, and we'll try and save a little time towards the end to have a more open discussion with folks. Okay, so Colleen, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Hi, folks. My name is Colleen Wessel-McCoy, and I have been a part of the Poverty Initiative, and now called the Kairos Center, since 2004. And this past spring finished a dissertation. My field, folks call me a historian, but I maintain that I'm not a historian. I'm a Christian ethicist. And I think that to do Christian ethics well, you have to know history. And so the project I looked at was the theology of Dr. Martin Luther King, particularly in these last years, as he and a multiracial group of leaders called for the Poor People's Campaign. And it was in the middle of this that King was assassinated. And so looking at that, King's theology and how as the most important American ethicist, really trying to understand that theology in the context of trying to transform society, and not a theology that was apart from trying to transform society and trying to really abolish the triple evils. He called them the triple evils of racism, poverty, and militarism. I'm going to use a PowerPoint, and for those that are calling in by phone, I will try to describe what the rest of us are looking at, but I'm going to switch to a shared screen here. So give me just a moment to pull up that PowerPoint. Let's see. Nick, it's not letting me share a screen.
No. What does it say?
It says the host disabled screen sharing. Keep in mind. So while Nick's giving me permission to share the screen, I'll say that it should be good. Okay, let me try. All right. For folks that are on a computer, can you see the PowerPoint, or do you still see me? Like, what are folks saying?
Yeah, I can see both.
You can see both. Okay. All right. Maybe we'll go with that. Let's see. There we go. How's that? Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So the webinar today is, I use this quote from King, "By the thousands we will move." And that's actually a quote that something that King said in describing the Poor People's Campaign 50 years ago, 4 days ago. So that was from a staff meeting, November 28th, 1967. And this was the staff meeting right before they made the official announcement of the Poor People's Campaign, which was December 4th. So we're coming up on Monday on the press release of the Poor People's Campaign. But this is King describing to the staff and really trying to pull the staff towards understanding why a Poor People's Campaign was what should be their next move. And so I'm going to pull up actually a couple of things that he said in talking about the significance and purpose of a Poor People's Campaign. And then I'll sort of start with a little bit of that, show some images of what actually transpired after he was killed, and then go back to talking a little bit more about why a Poor People's Campaign. So this was actually from, let me go back one more. This is from Vietnam. This was the famous anti-war speech where King came out publicly against the Vietnam War in April of 1967. This was 50 years before he was assassinated the day. So I'll read this. "We as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin to shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, The giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It is not haphazard and superficial. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. He also said, a month after that, in talking to the staff, he said, "We must recognize that we cannot solve our problem now until there is a radical redistribution of economic and political power. Now, when we see that there must be a radical redistribution of economic and political power, then we see that for the last 12 years, we have been a reform movement. Then after Selma and the Voting Rights Bill, we moved into a new era, which must be an era of revolution. I think we must see a great distinction between a reform movement and a revolutionary movement." So maybe I'll say something here. So you can see in this period where they've won these really landmark, unimaginable victories. A decade before, it was unimaginable that they would be able to topple Southern segregation. And as those landmark bills went into effect, King and others really assessed that as amazing as those victories were, that daily life for poor Southern Blacks was still abysmal, and that it was, and they went to Chicago and they were looking at living conditions in urban areas where there had not been the same formal segregation, but there still very much was housing segregation and poverty, and so they were really trying to figure out, and then so the Vietnam War was going on, really trying to figure out, what it is that had been successful, but then also what still laid ahead and what had they not accomplished. And so King is working out here, that the interrelatedness of war is that you can't solve questions of racism while there's still a war, and you can't solve questions of racism while there is persistent poverty. And he looked around and he acknowledged and recognized that most poor people at the time were white, and saw that there was this new opportunity to draw a larger section of the country together to try to take on some of these issues. Would someone, just to get a new voice in the room, would someone be willing to read this next quote?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. This is Raymond in Anchorage. Good morning.
Great, thank you.
Good morning in Anchorage, yes. The only real revolutionary, people say, is a man who has nothing to lose. There are millions of poor people in this country who have very little or even nothing to lose. If they can be helped to take action together, they will do so with a freedom and a power that will be a new force in our complacent national. I just got a pop-up on my screen. An unsettling force in our complacent national life. Beginning in the new year, 1968, we will be recruiting 3,000 of the poorest citizens from 10 different urban and rural areas to initiate and lead a sustained, massive, direct action movement in Washington.
Thank you. Great to have you with us from Alaska. So this is King. You can hear in this voice, this is not, none of these quotes are in the National Monument to Martin Luther King in Washington, D.C. This is not the I Have a Dream King. This is not what gets, comes over my email on King Day. And this is not what they show when they sign everybody up to be a volunteer to clean up schools on King Day. But this is what King was talking about and thinking about when he was assassinated. And this is what King was really working with everyone around him in trying to argue that they had been, as hard as they had worked and as amazing as the transformations had been, they had been a reform movement, and that the civil rights movement now must respond to the situation they found themselves. They must respond to the crisis around them with a human rights movement, and that a human rights movement would have to be a revolutionary movement, and that it couldn't just be reforms, but that the problems in society were so deep and so structured that it would take a complete transformation of political and economic life to really solve any of the triple evils, and that it was a lie to think that you could solve any one of those problems apart from one another. So I want to jump ahead, and we'll come back to King's thinking and come back a little bit more to the planning. But just so folks have in mind what we're talking about in terms of the Poor People's Campaign, which was initially called the Washington Campaign, but the Poor People's Campaign as it took place, like as it happened in history. And so the first day of the campaign is often dated to May 12th, which is the Mother's Day March. And the encampment in Washington, D.C. lasted until June 24th. So I'm going to show some images and describe what happened there, and we'll also have some testimony from some of the folks who were involved, played a leadership role in the campaign as it took place. This is an image from Solidarity Day. For those that are on the phone, what we're looking at is in the distance, there's the Washington Monument, the reflecting pool comes towards us, and then the Lincoln Memorial. And there's 50,000 people at least, that's the official count, sort of in front of the Lincoln Memorial. It looks a little bit like the March on Washington for Jobs or Income of 1963 or 4. I always forget that day, 3. So, but then if you look on the right side of the image, there between the trees, there is this whole encampment. And these are tents for housing 3,000 people, and they're A-frame plywood tents. And this is the encampment they called it Resurrection City, where people camped out on the lawn. There were over 6,000 people that came through Resurrection City. At any given time, there was space for 3,000 people to live there on the lawn. And they actually camped out there. It's Parks Department land. They occupied that land until they were forcibly evicted. There was another set of campaign occupants that lived nearby at a private high school called Hawthorne School. Here's a ground level view of Resurrection City. As you see, they put in plumbing, and then along each side you can see the A-frame tents. Here's a level view where you're looking inside the A-frame tents. There's 2 different families here, a poor Black family and a poor white family living in the tents of Resurrection City. This is the bakery. The Resurrection City had a number of amenities. It had a city hall, it had a cultural center, a daycare, a university, a mess hall, and a bakery. This is the bakery, and one of the things I like about this is it's got a biblical reference here. Bread free forever, give us this day is being painted. Give us this day our daily bread from the Lord's Prayer. This is inside the medical tent. One of the participants is getting medical care. Here's a night scene of folks gathered around a bonfire. And one of the things that was really important in Resurrection City was cultural exchange, and people really came together. People were coming, across race and ethnicity. They were also coming from across geography. So folks that had lived in rural areas were meeting people that lived in urban areas. People from the West were meeting people from the Northeast. And there was, getting together and spending time together was actually a really important opportunity. And people did use that time together for political discussion and cultural exchange, and just sort of starting to break down some of these barriers that kept folks divided from each other. So here's a description. This is actually a description of that kind of cultural exchange from the Hawthorne School, that second site. So Ernesto Vigil said, a white pianist starts playing this kick-ass boogie woogie on the piano. And all of a sudden, these poor white Appalachians were kicking their heels, Black folks jump in, and Mexicans sit around tapping their toes. You had an interesting cross-pollination. You can't structure that. And there's a lot of testimony from folks that were involved and lived in Resurrection City that this kind of exchange really was a big, important part of their experience there, and changed actually the kinds of organizing that they went on to do after their time in Resurrection City. Unfortunately, it rained. So here's an image within Resurrection City where it's so flooded that there's children that are playing with a raft and are actually floating around between the tents. It rained 28 of the 42 days of the encampment. And the, Washington, D.C. is not just metaphorically a swamp, it is literally a drained swamp. And so the, flooding there sticks. The Parks Department, before they came, had spread manure over the field so that when they left, grass would grow more easily. So part of the mud was also manure. But it stayed damp. People's clothes wouldn't dry. They were camping in very soggy and wet conditions. Would somebody be willing to read this quote from Miles Horton of the Highlander Center, who was there in Resurrection City? Maybe someone from this room. I don't know if folks are muted. Someone read it? Oh, sorry, y'all can't see it, can you? Thanks.
All right. When the rain started, a shelter was built above the fire where coffee was always boiling and around which good conversation or singing was always taking place. The scheduled sessions soon gave way to an 18-hour round of informal discussions, arguments, music, singing, coffee, drinking, and eating.
Thanks.
Yeah.
One of the most iconic parts of the campaign was the Mule Train, which came out of Marks, Mississippi. And this was something that King envisioned, that he had really been moved by a truth mission he participated in Marks, Mississippi while he was still alive, and saw children in a Head Start that were quartering an apple to share among the children, and describes sitting there and realizing that was all that they were going to get, and that's all they had to share with one another. And so this was a moment for him when he was really solidified in his commitment to a poor people's campaign, and that the poor themselves should be the ones that would come to Washington, D.C. And so this Mule Train wagon traveled from Marks to Washington, D.C. They took a train for a part of it. It was a little slower, I think, than they realized it was going to be. Here's an image of the breadth of leadership of the campaign. This is one of my favorite images of the campaign. It really highlights the important leadership from welfare rights and the multiracial character of the leadership, which drew together poor Blacks, poor whites, poor Mexican Americans, poor Natives, and poor Latinx and across ethnicity, and also Asian. There were a few Asian participants as well. And so here you can see this leadership, including also that there were a lot of really important women leaders, and I think that sometimes gets lost. The days, when they weren't at Resurrection City, they would go to actions at different sites in Washington, D.C. So, for example, when there was a Supreme Court ruling against fishing rights for natives in the Pacific Northwest, everybody went to the Supreme Court, not just the native leaders, but the whole cross-color delegation of activists went to the Supreme Court to protest that ruling. And so they would go to, the Department of Health and Human Services and talk about welfare, or they would go to the Department of Labor and talk about employment. And they would have both protests that were outside and sort of occupations, and then they would also go in and have appointments where people would testify, and they would have, talking about labor, and they would have people from across the country and across color lines all testifying about employment and wages. So there was a lot of policing of this occupation. and including a lot of undercover and paid informants from many branches of government, including military intelligence. This is for folks that are calling in, we're looking at an image of some of the policing. And then this is a copy of a COINTELPRO counterintelligence program memo from Sullivan to Moore. And it's kind of hard to read we're not going to read the text here, but it's an effort to plant among what they call cooperative news media sources on a confidential basis the idea that there's racial antagonisms within the Poor People's Campaign, specifically trying to say that the American Friends Service Committee, which played a very strong leadership role in the Poor People's Campaign, were not getting along, like the black leadership and white leadership were not getting along. And as of course there's always some element of truth, and then what is taken as it can be an interpersonal dispute or an inter-organizational dispute, then gets planted in cooperative news media sources and becomes the narrative of the campaign. So this is an example of that memo. There's also there was a similar memo around religious leadership before the campaign started, where they wanted to tell, they were worried that religious leaders had started and denominations had started to join the campaign. And so they wanted to sow the idea that that religious leaders are obligated to keep peace and order and that they shouldn't be involved in the campaign. Here's an image of the day when they forcibly shut down Resurrection City. And that was the end of the occupation. There was a phase 2 of the Poor People's Campaign, both in the Pacific Northwest around the fishing rights, and then also in Charleston, South Carolina, around a labor dispute of striking hospital workers. There were also a few efforts of folks that organized together using relationships that came out of the Poor People's Campaign, and I'll show a couple of those in a moment. But they really were able to sort of shut down both the occupation and in many ways this motion. It wasn't a huge success. There were some policy victories, and there were some, they got about $100,000 for Head Starts, and they expanded the food stamp program, were two of the main policy outcomes of the campaign. But I want to go back a little bit to talking about the plan for the campaign and what the idea behind the campaign and who all came together to be the leadership of the campaign. So I'm going back again. So this is a speech from King talking to the SCLC staff in January of 1968. So this is, about a month and a half after they had announced the campaign. It was still a little contentious within the staff. What is the campaign? Why are we doing this campaign? What is its purpose? And so here King is trying to articulate that to the staff. And I'm gonna let somebody read this. Somebody want to read it?
I'll read it.
Oh, thank you.
This is Jenny from Pocatello, Idaho.
Hi, Jenny.
Hi. If we say that power is the ability to affect change or the ability to achieve purpose, then it is not powerful to engage in an act that does not do that, no matter how much you sloganize and no matter how much you engage in action. In order for a movement to be effective, it must have the power to pull masses together, and it must have the power to make a dent on that kind of majority that has somehow allowed its conscience to go to sleep.
Thanks, Jenny. This is a very long passage, and maybe I'll read this one. Let me go back to where this is from King's last book called Where Do We Go From Here? Let's see, some of my screen is covered up too. There we go. And it's a 2-screen quote. So thanks for, I couldn't get it any shorter. I apologize for that. So for much of the last decade, we took on the task of ending conditions that had long outlived their purpose. The desegregation of most public facilities, for example, was overdue for change. It was not necessary to build a widespread organization in order to win legislative victories. Where the spotlight illuminated the evil, a legislative remedy was soon obtained that applied everywhere. As a consequence, permanent, seasoned, and militant organizations did not arise out of compelling necessity. We made easy gains, and we built the kind of organizations that expect easy victories and rest upon them. It may seem curious to speak of easy victories when some have suffered and sacrificed so much. Yet in candor and self-criticism, it is necessary to acknowledge that the torturous job of organizing solidly and simultaneously in thousands of places was not a feature of our work. Many civil rights organizations were born as specialists in agitation and dramatic projects. They attracted massive sympathy and support, but they did not assemble and unify the support for new stages of struggle. To move to higher levels of progress, we will have to have people tied together in long-term relationship instead of effervescent enthusiasts who lose their experience, spirit, and unity because they have no mechanism that directs them to new tasks. So this was King talking candidly about both, saying, it's hard to imagine, but people lost their lives in the fight for civil rights, and King saying that it's going to get harder, and that we have to organize in ways that are smarter, and that people, as we start to take on not just the South, but take on the nation and connect what's going on in the nation with global politics and talk about global freedom struggles, that if as hard as it was and as many lives were lost then, we can expect an even stronger response as we start to take on, the real power behind, behind the nation, and really ask for a change in power relationships, and that it's not limited to the South and not limited to the local. And so he's making an argument for how we build the kind of power that will be necessary to make change on that scale, and that you actually can't have that kind of change using the model that was successful in the civil rights movement, that mobilization would not be enough, that you would actually have to build power, and you'd have to have people tied together in thousands of people, in thousands of places, and not just as agitators, but as leaders, as real leaders. And so he's saying this at the same moment that many of the partners of the civil rights movement are actually turning against him. So like when he, some of the allies of the civil rights movement were, the media, particularly the, northern media, was able to help them gain national sympathy when they were, under attack by segregationist forces in the South. And the media really turned against King when he came out against the war and in taking on poverty, but also other civil rights organizations. And so, folks that had been partners of King in the past were now saying that he was doing a disservice to the cause of Black people by not staying in his place in dealing with, primarily Southern segregation. And so he was at the very moment that he was saying that we needed more people tied together, he was actually losing a lot of the support that he had. He also realized that if you're taking on something that is about the whole structure of society, and it's something that was causing hardship and oppression and dispossession for large segments of society, there were new potential partners. And so King started to look around, and this is where he's looking at that there are more poor white people than there are poor people of color. And he's looking at folks that are doing welfare rights organizing and starting to reach out to poor mothers who are taking on the welfare system. And he's looking at labor unions and seeing, many of the labor unions were very racist and actually used unions to further segregation. But that he saw that actually that their causes should be won, and that if you could find the right labor unions and win people together, that could be a new source for this era. And then looking at, Native organizing, Mexican American organizing, and looking north and south. And so we called folks together. And so this list here is the initial group of people that came together for a Poor People's Campaign. And I think that it's important here that these were not individual poor people from these different areas and cross color lines, but they were organizations that were already organizing, and they were networks of people, community and religious leaders that were doing really important work. And so for folks that can't see this screen, it's a very full screen, but it includes organizations like, so among American Indians, the Lumbee Indian Citizens Council from North Carolina, the Sioux Indian Council from South Dakota, the National Indian Youth Council, among others. And then among Mexican Americans, Crusade for Justice, which was a very large organization, Mexican American Youth Organization, often called MAYO, and then the Federal Alliance of New Mexico. Puerto Ricans, it was primarily folks from the Northeast, including the Puerto Rican Community Development Project and Casa Puerto Rico. And then among Appalachian whites, there was the Appalachian Volunteers, SCEF, Southern Conference Education Fund, and then the Poor People's Committee of Hazard, Kentucky. There were also Northern poor whites, particularly Join Community Union out of Chicago. Migrant and agricultural labor, including the United Farm Workers, FLOC, and then South Florida Migrants Council. There were civil rights organizations still there in addition to SCLC, including SNCC and the Southern Regional Council. Welfare rights played a really important role and was really strongly present, both the national and then Newark, Brooklyn, Rochester, and Chicago groups. There were unions there, including one AFL-CIO from West Virginia. Anti-war groups were there, Fort Hood 3 Committee, and then there was organized religion. American Friends, again, really important role, Catholics, Jews, UCC, and Presbyterians. The Highlander Center was there, and then Students for Democratic Socialism was there. Tom Hayden was there. So I called all those folks together. It's actually not the right date here, but I'm going to show a short video clip of what King said when those folks were together. They met at Pascal's, which was a restaurant and hotel that SCLC used, and this is what King said when he gathered that group of leaders together.
We assemble here together today with common problems, bringing together ethnic groups that maybe have not been together in this type of meeting in the past. I know I haven't been in a meeting like this, and it's been one of my dreams that we would come together and realize our common problems. Power for poor people will really mean having the ability, the togetherness, the assertiveness, and the aggressiveness to make the power structure of this nation say yes when they may be desirous of saying no.
So after, when folks gather together, part of what they put together is this committee of 100 that would be the leadership of the Poor People's Campaign. And so at this point, it really was a campaign that was not just led by King or the SCLC, but it was a campaign that had a diverse and multiracial leadership. There was a steering committee of 8 key leaders that came out of that. And then they put together this press release. And so this is a passage from the press release. It says, delegates repeatedly pointed out that the established powers of rich America have deliberately exploited poor people by isolating them in ethnic, nationality, religious, and racial groups. As one poor white person explained, it is not really the poor people who are responsible for hatred in our country, but the powerful economic and political managers who want to keep us down. We will no longer permit them to divide us. So so this is a statement from the SCLC from that committee of 100. King was killed 3 weeks after this meeting. So 3 weeks after he brought people together, he was assassinated. And I think that this actually moving to organize the leaders from across the nation, across racial and ethnic lines, across geographic lines, and building for to have a leadership that had the power that was capable of transforming political and economic power relations in the nation was the reason that he was assassinated. So Miles Horton had written a letter, Miles Horton from the Highlander Center had written a letter to Andrew Young and Cesar Chavez talking about that meeting, which he was at. And he said, "I believe we caught a glimpse of the future at the March 14 meeting, the making of a bottom-up coalition. This could lay the groundwork for something tremendously exciting and significant." So it was so he wrote this letter on April 3rd, and then before he mailed it, King was assassinated. And so there's actually, at the bottom of this letter, there's a footnote that says, "Oh my God, King," and this is paraphrase. He said, King has been killed, and I'm still reeling from that, and we need to figure out, this coalition is now more important than ever. But that's how quickly that changed. I mean, that's how short a time between that meeting and the assassination is that, and it's just, it's a hard letter to read. I want to go back to, let's see, one more passage for King, and then I want to move into a little bit of some of what other folks said, and then have some time for questions. So again, this is from King's last book. He said, "When a people are mired in oppression, they realize deliverance when they have accumulated the power to enforce change. When they have amassed such strength, the writing of a program becomes almost an administrative detail. It is immaterial who presents the program. What is material is the presence of an ability to make events happen. The call to prepare programs distracts us excessively from our basic and primary task. We are, in fact, being counseled to put the cart before the horse. Our nettlesome task is to discover how to organize our strength into compelling power so that government cannot elude our demands. We must develop from strength a situation in which the government finds it wise and prudent to collaborate with us." So again, this sort of idea that if they could organize themselves, that it was finding the strength and organization to put into place real change was the task, and that they, by being always told, well, just give us a program, and you don't have to come to Washington, give us a program and we'll see what we can do. And King was saying, no, that actually is a way of keeping us from doing what is necessary in this time. So here's some thoughts from the leadership of what actually transpired after King was assassinated. So one is that there was a group of leaders, many of them had been at that March meeting, who's put together a proposal for a poor people's embassy. So this is the grant proposal. And they said, "The campaign has united the poor, the alienated, the disenfranchised from all parts of the country and all races. And it has demonstrated, at least for the direct participants and those who observe the process, that this kind of experience, apart from its effect on Congress and the government, can begin to set in motion certain forces, can instill a sense of unity, of leadership, and of solidarity, which has a momentum in life of its own." So their idea is that they were going to, even though the encampment was ending, that they were going to have a way of continuing to have this network of people that would start to build relationships and build together as they called it a poor people's embassy. And they did not get funded. So this was a proposal that lasted only, that network lasted only about 2 years, and just didn't have the funding to keep going. So this is Peggy Terry, an excerpt from her Solidarity Day speech. So this was the Juneteenth big gathering on the Washington lawn. So poor whites are here today to make ourselves visible to a society whose continued existence depends on the denial of our existence. We are here today united with other races of poor people, Puerto Ricans, Mexican Americans, Indians, and Black people in a common cause. That common cause is freedom. So Jesse Jackson was part of the SCLC at the time. He did spend a lot of time in Resurrection City, and many of so Abernathy and some of the other leaders actually didn't live in Resurrection City, even though they had a kind of fancier tent built for them in Resurrection City, and had this day when they called the press and got their suitcase and moved into Resurrection City, and then they stayed at a hotel. But Jesse Jackson did spend more time in Resurrection City, and he said, this is in Ebony magazine, said, in Resurrection City, the poor whites began to see how they had been used as tools of the economic system to keep other minority groups in check. Their problems are basically the same as ours, a need for food, jobs, medicine, and schools. However, they were given police rights over, and then he uses the N-word, but I won't, a plan which satisfies their sick egos but does not deal with any of their basic problems. It was in our wallowing together in the mud of Resurrection City that we were allowed to hear, to feel, and to see each other for the first time in our American experience. And then this is Tilly Walker, who was a Mandan, from the Mandan tribe, and she was part of a group called the Coalition of American Indian Citizens Steering Committee. And so this was a group that came out of the Poor People's Campaign of Native leaders who met each other through the campaign. So, one of the things that happened is that, it wasn't just the different ethnic and racial groups meeting each other for the first time, but some of the organizing happened even within those groups that had not met each other before. And so Tilly says, the growing revolution of poor people is not an issue of race, class, or culture, but is a moral issue in the most basic sense. The right of people to live and to live how they choose. To achieve that right requires more than concern and recognition. It demands action, competent, knowledgeable, and effective, aimed at breaking apart and dissolving those programs, policies, agencies, and traditions that deny that right. So this is just a few glimpses of some of this diverse leadership that was sort of coincided with a lot of the narrative of the Poor People's Campaign that came out through the media was really the leadership of the SCLC. And so it was the male pastors and this very patriarchal leadership, and then it was a leadership that really sort of tended to mostly think about continue to think about this in lines with the civil rights movement, and didn't really do a good job of making this transition to being a human rights movement. And there was a lot going on at the time, and they were still reeling from King's assassination and how to be the SCLC and lead this very new and very different kind of campaign, when a lot of the people that were leading the campaign had been opposed to doing this campaign. And then when King was killed, they were put in charge of a campaign that they didn't necessarily want and certainly didn't understand. And so I think that is definitely true. There was also a lot of the media didn't like the campaign, and that there's an article by a scholar named Gordon Mantler that really looks at the role of the media in how all of this went down, and I recommend that. So there were many dynamics here, and sort of leading to what some people called the little bighorn of the civil rights movement, or the death of the civil rights movement. That this was the last campaign that really ended an era. So Michael Harrington calls it the end of an era, and like a tragic end of the era. So there's a lot of bad feelings about the Poor People's Campaign. But then at the same, and I a lot of that is true. I think at the same time, there was both a very different idea of the purpose of the campaign. And that was that the campaign was part of a human rights movement, and that it was not the entirety of that human rights movement, but it was sort of it was supposed to start to put into motion a leadership of that movement. And it was it was going to bring together this new leadership that would then build power together and be able to put into action a human rights movement. And it would move the nation, and it would put the issue of poverty in a real way on the national table, and it would tie the issues together. And that, so like on the question of the war, the idea is that if you if you really won the demands of a Poor People's Campaign, you couldn't put the amount of money necessary towards solving those issues and still wage a war. And so the war in Vietnam would have to be ended in order for the demands of the poor to be met domestically. And so by moving on the issue of poverty, they were also moving on the issue of war. And that by bringing people together across racial lines and by making addressing poverty not a Black issue, as it became, there was a campaign in the 80s to really racialize and feminize poverty. And we have a legacy of that today. But the purpose here with the Poor People's Campaign was to make human rights something that was fulfilled by all and was not a special interest. It wasn't something that affected only a small segment of society, but it was something about transforming the entire society, and therefore was something that was desirable by all people. It wasn't flinging a coin to a better beggar, but it was transforming a society that creates beggars. And so all of this is within the vision for what the Poor People's Campaign could be. And then there was motions within what transpired that was that. But I think that the opportunity today is to take up and lift up both that broad leadership and to build a broad leadership today for a human rights movement. And that a Poor People's Campaign for today is a campaign, which is not a movement. A campaign is part of a movement, but a campaign to really change the narrative in our nation, to make it clear that addressing poverty is not a small segment of society. It's not just women, it's not just people of color, but it's all of us. And that it is about transforming society. It's about real power changes in political and economic structures. And that a Poor People's Campaign starts to make that narrative and starts to build that leadership. And that is what was called for, not just by King, but by this broad, nationwide, cross-color lines, strongly women leadership. And this is the opportunity that we have 50 years later. So I didn't leave much time for questions, but I think we have just a couple of minutes. If folks have thoughts or questions, I'll stop sharing. Let's see.
Thank you so much, Colleen, and I just think it's so important to have a chance to hear some of this history and learn a little bit about the struggle as we prepare again to undertake this very complex and dangerous project of uniting the poor and dispossessed, and so I'm really appreciative to have had this chance with you to share some of this history. And so, yeah, folks, we do have a few minutes, and it would be great to hear from anybody out there that has a burning question or comment. So if you could just use the chat bar. Do we have anything, Nick?
Not yet.
Well, people are thinking. I just want to remind you that the 12th.
Hey, I guess I have a question, or it's a question and a comment, I guess.
Great.
Who is this? My name is Garth Jensen. I'm in the DC area. So first, I just want to say thanks to Colleen for this, for your dissertation and your work. So the question / comment is, I saw Miles Horton quoted a few times in your presentation. Have you read a book called Unearthing Seeds of Fire?
Yeah, that's a great book.
Okay, yeah, I it was a leading question leading to the comment, which is, I stumbled on that 2 years ago, totally by accident, and I started reading it, and literally I read until like 4 a.m, and I couldn't put it down, and I was just so shocked at what I was learning. And I'm in my like mid to late 50s, and I honestly did not know that chapter of American history. So it's part of my journey onto this, being here on this call today.
Yeah, I I can agree with that. That very much was part of really what was part of my political formation was Miles Horton and the Highlander Center. My son is actually named Miles after Miles Horton.
Okay, that's pretty cool.
if that can be taken as an endorsement and an agreement there. And Miles really was there in Resurrection City, and really they organized the Highlander Center West, coming out of the and tried to work in the Southwest, particularly with the Mexican American organizing there and the land rights, and have a Highlander Center project there.
We have another question? You want to read it?
Yeah, a question from Janine. How do you see the current government disarray affecting the new campaign?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. And one of the things so part of what I sometimes end up doing is sort of looking up pieces of the history to contribute to today's campaign. And I was just in the archives at Emory University looking at their SCLC files, and one of the things that folks asked me to look for is this question of political, so of politics and how they navigated the politics. And 1968. So this is not exactly a question. But it's sort of an acknowledgement of yes, that is a very real part of trying to wage a campaign today is that chaos. So in 1968 was an election year. And it was Nixon. So Nixon running, Bobby Kennedy was running and was assassinated. And then, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on his name. Fred Hampton was assassinated, but the segregationist that was running, Wallace. Oh, yeah. So Wallace was running for president and actually won southern states, did really well in some northern states. And so there was this, there was very much, so someone was, who was it that was saying, I guess Bishop Barber was saying that, if you look at Governor Wallace's campaign speech he spoke in Madison Square Garden, and some of the Trump, so to take just one of the chaotic players in Washington today is Trump, one among many, but Trump was borrowed from some of the elements of Wallace's campaign speech in his speech, including this idea that you sort of get your audience to throw out anybody that's a detractor, sort of but that there are this right populism of Wallace, that there's elements of that today. The resurgence of segregationists, nationalists, and Nazis, I think that was very much a part of the work of 68. And so it's both a very different time today, but I think there is still some to learn from that period in terms of, one thing that was different at that time is that, it was an election year, but when the campaign was going on, the Democratic Party controlled all branches of government. So they had Johnson in the White House, they had both houses, and then they had a majority on the Supreme Court. And so it was both a very different time, and then yet there are these elements today of a revival of some of what was most dangerous in that time. And so I think part of what King really believed is that, and perhaps we can do another webinar sometime soon. I would love to talk a little bit about the theology, which was sort of where I was coming in with the dissertation, but the theology and ethics and the biblical references of the campaign, and really trying to call the nation, and really believing that the nation cared about the poor, and that this question of poverty would be one that people would be a call that people would answer, and that if you could sort of appeal to this imperative that the poor, the outcast, the widow, the child are the children of God, and are, that a society is judged based on how the least of these are treated, and then call to that instinct and that impulse and that good sense, and call that forward, and then make the point in that the way we do that is not flinging a coin to a beggar, but changing a society that creates beggars, changing a structure that creates beggars, that America was prepared to do that. And that I still think that is true today, that there is this, this morality has been taken and moved in a way that is actually against our religious values and our religious sense, even when it parades as religious values and preys upon the Bible and misuses the Bible, that is still there in religious forms and in non-religious forms and in humanist and secular forms. And I think that a Poor People's Campaign has the potential to draw upon that and sort of cut through some of the nonsense by saying that this is a question of morality, and it's a question of morality that has to do with structures.
So sorry, everyone. I know there's probably a lot more on people's minds, and I would love to keep talking, but I also want to respect that everyone probably has to get back to work or whatever, get ready for the weekend. So thank you, Colleen, and thank you, everyone, for being here. And just a couple of reminders that, well, first of all, I think I took that as sort of a promise that we will have another webinar with Colleen to discuss the theological and spiritual dimensions of the Poor People's Campaign, which is just a very critical discussion, and I think very rich. And so look for that in the future. Maybe not until January, because we have a couple of other things coming up. On the 12th, we're going to be joined by Kenya Aloser of she's a leader in the Poor People's Campaign out in Los Angeles, and she's going to talk with us a little bit about the work that they do in Los Angeles, and in particular, some of the sort of religious elements that is brought out through that work. And then we're going to hold a Bible study on the 19th about the birth story of Jesus. So there's a lot of good leaders in our network that are going to join in for that, and I think it's just another really important thing to be doing in this time of year, this season, when we remember this story and celebrate this story, but then to connect it to the project that we're doing to unite the poor and to build this campaign and kind of resist the forces that use and abuse that story for so long. So look forward to that on the 19th. We'll get email information out to everybody, and yeah, tune in on the 4th to the press conference of where we're going to be launching the campaign. Very exciting. So thanks again. Any last final words from Colleen? No?
Yeah, just if you go to poorpeoplescampaign.org, there's a pledge card if you want to sign up to stay connected and join. And there's a number of ways of being involved in the Poor People's Campaign today. And so mark how you want to be engaged and make sure that we have you counted among that number. So,
all right.
Yeah.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll talk to you soon. Have a great weekend.
Yeah.